Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Some days change everything. You wake up thinking it's just another ordinary Tuesday, but by evening, your whole world has shifted. This was one of those days for me. The rain started before dawn. I remember lying in bed listening to the first gentle drops hitting my bedroom window. By morning, it had grown into a proper storm, the kind that makes you want to stay inside, with a warm cup of tea and a good book. For hours, the rain kept falling. It drummed against my roof like tiny fingers tapping out a song. Usually, this sound made me feel peaceful and safe. But that Tuesday afternoon, something felt different. The rhythm seemed to match the restless beating of my own heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 52 years old. 3 years ago, I lost my husband, David. People always say that grief gets easier with time, and in some ways, they're right. The sharp, cutting pain that once took my breath away has softened into something more manageable. But loneliness? That's a different beast entirely. It comes and goes like an unwelcome visitor, especially on days like this when the weather traps you inside with nothing but your own thoughts for company. I was sitting on my favorite sofa. It's the blue one David and I picked out together 7 years ago. A novel lay open in my lap, but I wasn't really reading. Instead, I found myself staring out at my garden through the rain-streaked window. My roses, usually so proud and upright, were bending under the weight of the water. Their heads hung low, heavy with rain, looking as tired as I felt. The house felt enormous around me. Every room seemed to echo with emptiness. It wasn't the comfortable kind of quiet that comes when you're content to be alone. This was the heavy kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes you aware of every little sound: the tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of old floorboards settling. I missed having someone to share the silence with. I missed the easy comfort of David's presence, even when we weren't talking. I missed knowing that I wasn't the only person breathing in this big, quiet house. Sighing, I pushed a loose strand of hair away from my face. At my age, I often felt like I was stuck between 2 chapters of my life. The first chapter, being a wife and mother, was finished. My children, Sarah and Michael, were grown up now with busy lives of their own. I was proud of them, of course, but their absence added another layer of quiet to my days. The next chapter, I had no idea what that was supposed to look like. That's when I heard it. A knock at my front door. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was polite, careful even. But it was definitely there. I froze, my book sliding off my lap onto the floor. Visitors were rare in my world, especially on a miserable Tuesday afternoon when the rain was coming down like this. My first thought was that it might be Carol, my neighbor from the house on the left. Maybe she needed to borrow some sugar or wanted to complain about the new family that had moved in across the street. Carol had a habit of stopping by at odd times, usually when she was bored or had run out of people to talk to on the phone. But then the knock came again. This time it was a little firmer, more urgent. Whoever was out there really needed something. I set my book aside and stood up, my heart doing a strange little dance in my chest. It was partly curiosity, partly a weird kind of nervousness that I couldn't explain. I smoothed down my green sweater, the soft one that David always said brought out my eyes, and walked slowly toward the front door. The hallway felt longer than usual. My bare feet made soft padding sounds on the hardwood floor. When I reached the door, I stood on my tiptoes and peered through the small peephole. It wasn't Carol, it was Mark. Mark Harrison from 2 houses down the street. I blinked in surprise and looked again to make sure. Yes, it was definitely Mark. I didn't know him very well. Over the years since David and I had moved to Maple Street, we'd shared the occasional wave when we were both getting our mail. Sometimes we'd have brief conversations about the weather or neighborhood news. He seemed like a nice enough man, quiet, kept to himself mostly. I guessed he was around my age, maybe a little older. He'd been living in that small brick house longer than David and I had been here. And as far as I knew, he'd always lived alone. But the Mark I was looking at through my peephole looked nothing like the neat, reserved man I was used to seeing. This Mark looked like he'd been through a battle with the storm and lost. Rain had completely soaked him. His graying hair was plastered flat against his head, and water dripped steadily from the brim of his old baseball cap. The cap was pulled low over his eyes, but I could see that his shoulders were slumped in defeat. He was holding something small and shiny in his hand, turning it over and over between his fingers like a worry stone. He wasn't looking at my door. Instead, his gaze was fixed on his feet as he shifted his weight from one leg to the other on my welcome mat. The poor mat was probably soaked through by now, doing its best to soak up the rain that was dripping off him. Something about the way he stood there, so lost, so uncertain, tugged at my heart. I could see that whatever had brought him to my door in this weather, it wasn't good news. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the deadbolt with slightly shaking fingers. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the safety chain attached. "Mark," I called out, and my voice sounded rough and unused. "Is everything okay?" He looked up suddenly, startled, as if he hadn't really expected anyone to answer the door. His eyes, which I remembered being a clear, bright blue, looked troubled and cloudy. Rain was running down his cheeks in steady streams, and in the dim, gray light, it was hard to tell if some of those drops might have been tears. "Oh, ... Hello, Eleanor," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he hadn't used it much lately either. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm really sorry to bother you. Truly sorry. This ... Well, this is pretty embarrassing." He held up the object he'd been turning over in his hand, and I could see what it was now, a house key. But not just any house key. This one was broken cleanly in 2 pieces. "I locked myself out," he said, his voice barely above a mumble. He was looking down at the broken key pieces again, not meeting my eyes. "My phone's inside, my wallet's inside. Everything's inside." And then I went and snapped the key in half, trying to force the lock open. Pretty stupid, right? He attempted a small smile, the kind you give when you're trying to make light of something that's actually quite serious. But the smile didn't reach his eyes, and it faded quickly. There was something vulnerable about the way he stood there, something raw and exposed that went beyond just being locked out in the rain. He looked utterly lost and defeated. Standing there on my doorstep with the storm raging around him, something inside me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time, stirred to life. "Oh, Mark," I said, quickly sliding the chain lock off and opening the door wide. "That's awful. Come in, please. Come inside before you get any wetter than you already are." He hesitated, glancing back toward his own house down the street. From here, I could see it looked dark and empty, with no warm lights in the windows to welcome him home. "I don't want to impose on you," he started, rain still dripping from his chin. "I know we don't really know each other that well, and I'm dripping all over your nice clean doorstep, ... "Nonsense," I said firmly, stepping back and gesturing for him to come in. "Get yourself inside right now. We'll figure something out. Can use my phone to call a locksmith, or maybe we can think of another solution." After another moment of hesitation, he finally stepped across my threshold. The scent of rain and damp earth followed him into my hallway, along with something else, a kind of weariness that seemed to cling to him like the wet clothes. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, water pooling at his feet on my tile floor. He was still clutching those broken key pieces like they were evidence of some terrible crime he'd committed. Without the vast, stormy sky as a backdrop, he looked smaller somehow, more fragile than I'd expected. His usual quiet reserve, the polite distance he'd always maintained during our brief neighborhood encounters, seemed to have washed away with the rain. In its place was something raw and tired, something that spoke of struggles that went far deeper than just being locked out of his house. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said finally, meeting my eyes properly for the first time. "I really appreciate this." When our eyes met, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. There was an exhaustion there that went bone deep, a kind of weariness that I recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Someone who was tired of being strong all the time. It was unsettling and oddly compelling at the same time. I felt a flicker of something beyond simple neighborly concern. It was empathy, sharp and sudden, hitting me like a wave. I knew exactly what it felt like to feel adrift in your own life, even if our circumstances might be different. The quiet house that had felt so empty just moments before suddenly seemed to hum with his unexpected presence. The silence that had been pressing down on me was now filled with possibility. With the kind of electric tension that comes when two people recognize something familiar in each other. I closed the door behind him, shutting out the angry roar of the storm. Now there was just the sound of water dripping from Mark's jacket onto my mat, the quiet hum of my house settling around us, and the unsteady rhythm of my own breathing. "Let me get you a towel," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and welcoming while pushing down this strange flutter of nerves in my stomach. "And how about some coffee or tea if you prefer?" He pulled off his soaked baseball cap and ran his hand through his wet hair. I was surprised to see that there was more gray in it than I'd realized. Silver streaks that caught the light from my hallway lamp. "Coffee would be wonderful," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "It's really not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," I assured him, already heading toward the kitchen. "Make yourself comfortable." Well, as comfortable as you can be while you're soaking wet. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw him still standing uncertainly by the door, like he wasn't sure where he belonged or what he was supposed to do with himself. There was definitely a story behind those troubled eyes. I was sure of it now. Something much bigger and more complicated than just a broken house key. And surprisingly, unexpectedly, a part that had felt dormant and sleepy for so long felt a curious flutter of interest in what that story might be. The rain continued its relentless drumming against my windows. But inside, the silence had completely transformed. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of loneliness. Instead, it was filled with a kind of uncertain potential. Like the moment before something important happens. By the time I returned from the kitchen with coffee and a thick, warm towel, Mark had shed his soaked jacket. He'd hung it carefully on the coat hook by the door, but only after I'd insisted several times that it was okay. Now he was perched on the very edge of my armchair, the one closest to the window, holding his coffee mug like it was something precious. He'd used the towel I'd given him to dry his hair, and without the wet strands plastered to his head, he looked more like the Mark I was used to seeing around the neighborhood. But there was still something different about him, something that made me want to sit down and really listen to whatever he might be willing to share. The afternoon stretched ahead of us, full of rain and unexpected possibilities. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't dreading the quiet hours alone. To dry his hair and face, but his clothes were still damp, and he seemed hesitant to lean back against the fabric of the chair. I sat on the sofa opposite him, cradling my own mug. The novel forgotten, the cushion beside me, the initial awkwardness lingered, punctuated by the clink of his mug against the saucer and the relentless patter of rain. He'd thanked me again for the coffee, his gaze drifting towards the window, towards his own house, barely visible through a terry curtain. "Did you want to call Alex Smith?" "Now," I asked, gently breaking silence, "I can look one up for you." Heshook, his head slowly still staring out the window. "Not yet, maybe. Maybe I'll just twat a bit. See if the rain lets up." His voice was still low, tinged with that some weariness I'd noticed. At the door, it wasn't the response I expected. Most people would be anxious to get back into their house. His reluctance felt significant. "Hey, are you sure?" I pressed lightly. "It could take them a while to get here in this weather." He finally turned his gaze back to me. The troubled look was still there, maybe even more pronounced now that he was out of Thielman's. "It's all right, Lana. Annan Slithers, there's nothing urgent waiting for me in there," he said it quietly, but words hung in the air heavy with implication. It felt like a confession veiled, though it was my own experience with grief and loneliness echoed in his tune. I recognized the feeling of a house I thought was just walls and furniture, not necessarily a refuge. I decided not to posh the locksmith issue instead. I took a sip of my coffee and tried a different approach. Nasty weather, I offered, stating obvious. Seems like it's settled in fourth day. He nodded, tracing the rim of his meg with a finger. It does figures today, all days oh. I kept my tone light, inviting, but not demanding. He hesitated, looking down into his coffee as if this whirling cream held some answer. It would have been my anniversary today. He said so softly, I almost didn't catch it. My wedding anniversary. The air thickened suddenly. His presence, his reluctance, his damp clothes, and his troubled eyes snapped into focus. This wasn't just about a broken key. Oh, Mark, I breathed, my own chest tightening with empathy. I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were that you were married. He managed a faint, sad smile. Was a long time ago, Clara. She passed away. 15 years now. 15 years he'd been alone in that house, down street, carrying that loss for 15 years. I'd lived here for 10 of those, completely oblivious, exchanging pliostry over the fence, never guessing the depth of history and sorrow behind his quiet demeanor. I had no idea. Said sincerely, that must be incredibly difficult, especially today. He nodded, looking away again, but this time it felt less like avoidance and more like introspection. Some years are harder than others. This year feels heavy. I was going to visit her at the cemetery, but the rain and then this stupid key. Heshook, his head, frustration and sadness warring on his face. It just felt like Thellist straw. You know, I didn't know I knew about anniversaries that punched the air out of your lungs. I knew about days when simple frustrations felt like insurmountable obstacles because they were piled on top of a grief that never truly disappeared. I do know, I said quietly. My husband David. It's been almost 3 years for me. Mark looked up, high size widening slightly in surprise, then softening with understanding. Oh, Eleanorium, sorry, I didn't realize a fragile bridge of shared experience for midwin us. In that moment, spanning the space between the sofa and the armchair, we were two people in the same quiet neighborhood, living parallel lives marked by loss, unaware of the calm round beneath our feet until a broken key and a rainy Tuesday brought us together. It's okay, I assured him. It's part of life, isn't it, learning to navigate the anniversaries, the quiet days. He held my gaze for a long moment, assilent acknowledgement passing between us. The air no longer felt awkward, but filled with a quiet, shared understanding. So he said, his voice a little steadier, you get it, the feeling like the house is too quiet some nights? Yes, I admitted, especially on days like today. He took another sip of his coffee, seeming to relax fractionally against the back of the chair. The rain outside seemed less intrusive now, more like a gentle backdrop to the unexpected dinnicky unfolding within my living room. He hadn't just brought the rain inside, it brought a shared humanity, vulnerability that resonated deeply with my own. We sat in silence for a while after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Not empty, but contemplative. It felt companionable, strangely comfortable given we were practically strangers just an hour ago. Mark seemed lost in thought, this gaze distant, but the tension had dazed from his shoulders. I found myself studying him discreetly, the lines it shed around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he held the coffee mug. The Wazy's quietness seemed less like aloofness, and more like a protective shell built over years of solitary grief. I wandered about Clara, about the life Beth shared in that house down the street. 15 years was a long time to hold into sorrow alone. Did you two live in thought house together? I asked, softly breaking the quiet spell. I worried he might be overstepping, but the shared vulnerability seemed to invite a gentler keen of curiosity. He looked up, seemingly unsurprised by the question. We did. He might, nostalgic smile touching his lips. Bought it just after we got married. Fixed it up ourselves mostly. She loved the garden. His eyes drifted towards my window again, perhaps picturing his own garden, the one Clara had loved. She had this incredible knack for making things grow roses, mostly old fashioned ones with names I could never remember. The whole backyard smelled amazing in the summer. He spoke about her with a quiet reverence, a mixture of love and enduring sadness. I could almost picture her tending Harris's. Her presence filling the Huzathot now stood silent. "That sounds lovely," I said. "Sincerely, Mike David." Was Day Gardner here? I'd try my best, but mostly he just managed not to kill things, Hed chuckled softly. A genuine sound this time. It warmed the room slightly. Claros to say I had a black thumb Calden, even keep a cactus alive. Wet talked a little more then about gardens and the neighborhood, about how things had changed over the years. It was easy conversation flowing naturally from the shared ground. We discovered he asked about David, about my children listing in Gattenley, as I spoke about them, my voice catching slightly when I mentioned Ed Ho much. I missed the noise they used to mock in the house. He didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts, just listened, with a quiet empathy that felt more genuine than any well-meaning condolences I'd received. He understood the landscape of loss in a way Foy Wathers did. As we talked, I noticed the subtle shift in him. He seemed less burdened, the rawness I'd seen earlier soft tuning into a quiet melancholy. Sharing his story, even just fragments of fits, seemed to have lightened the load evenly slightly. The rain began to ease, that phronic drumming softening to a more gentle patter. The gray light outside seemed a fraction brighter. Mark glanced towards the window again. "Looks like it might be letting up soon," he observed. "Maybe I should think about that, locksmith." "There's no rush," I said, quickly surprised by my own reluctance. See him go. The unexpected connection had filled the lonely afternoon in a way hadn't anticipated. "Unless you need to get back." He shook his head. "No, like I said, nothing urgent." He paused, looking at me thoughtfully. "Thank you, Eleanor, for coffee, for listening. It's been a long time since I talked about CL." The rain eventually subsided to a thin drizzle, the clouds thinning enough to let a watery late afternoon light filter through. Mark finally decided it was to call the locksmith. I found the number for a local company, and he made the call, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. No arranging for someone to come out. He thanked me again as he hung up, a genuine warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there when he first arrived, drenched and distressed. They said it might be about an hour. He told me, standing up and stretching slightly, I should probably head back, wait for them outside. "Couldn't have to stand out there," it protested. "You can wait here, have anotherapy." He smiled, a proper smile, this time that reached his eyes, crinkling thickerners. "Thank you, Eleanor, but I think he'll be okay now. A little fresh air might do me good after being cooped up." He picked up the broken key pieces. "And Mabe, I'll take a walk past the cemetery afterwards if it stays dry enough. I didn't get to go this morning, but maybe the afternoon's not too late." There was acquiescent determination in his voice, a sense of purpose restored. It felt like our conversation, the simple act of sharing his grief and having it acknowledged, had helped him navigate the emotional hurdle the day he went to the hallway to retrieve his still damp jacket. As he put it on, he paused, turning back to me. "Eleanor," he began, then hesitated, searching for the right words. "Today was to fix showing up on your doorstep like that. I wasn't myself. Thank you for being so kind, for not just seeing a clumsy neighbor who broke his key." "Mark," I said, softly meeting his gaze, "we all have days like that, days when we need some Ionetto. Just open the door. I'm glad I wash her." He nodded, a flicker of that earlier vulnerability crossing his face, but this time overlaid with gratitude. Me to hop in the front door, and a wave of cool damp air washed into the hall, smelling clean and earthy after the rain. The sun was even trying to break through the clouds in the west, casting long weak shadows across the wet pavement. "Well," he said, stepping onto the porch, "I guess you'll see you around, neighbor." "See? Oh, around, Mark," I replied, a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the coffee. I watched him walk down the path, his shoulders straighter, his stride more purposeful. He turned at the sidewalk and gave a small wave for heading towards his house. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, the quiet of the house settling back around me. But it felt different now, less empty, more peaceful. The encounter had been new and unexpected, yes, but profoundly human, no grand drama, no unbelievable twist in the conventional sense, but a quiet unfolding off shared experience, mutual respect, Andy. Surprising comfort found in simple kindness. It was a reminder that connection can bloom in the most unlikely often when we least expect it. But perhaps need it most, looking around my living room at the two coffee mugs still sitting there. I felt a sense of quiet growth. The loneliness that had clung to me earlier seemed to have erased, replaced by a gentle sense of hope. Maybe the next chapter wasn't about grand adventures or new romances, but about these small, significant cants, about opening the door literally and figuratively to the people sharing the same small patch of throws. The rain had stopped outside. I could hear a bird tentatively starting to sing, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel like an absence, but like a space waiting to be filled gently with whatever life might bring next. The unexpected neighbor, the broken key, the shared hour on a rainy afternoon. It wasn't earth-shattering first, but it had shifted something within me, leaving behind a quiet resonance. Reminder of the enduring power of simple human connection.